Boulay, and I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we're continuing to explore African American culture, and we have a fascinating subject. We're going to talk about how 5 slave women outsmarted the system. These women are interesting and just fascinating, and I think you're going to enjoy meeting them. So let's get into it. Let's talk about how 5 slave women outsmarted the system. Our first slave diva is Mary Elizabeth Bowser. Mary Bowser was born in 1839 in Virginia on the plantation of Richard Van Loo. At a very early age, her parents were sold, so she was pretty much a child of the plantation. When Mary was 12, Richard Van Loo died, and his daughter Elizabeth inherited his slaves. She immediately set them free. Elizabeth Van Loo was an abolitionist, which is to say that she did not believe in slavery and worked to end the institution. But even though they were free, several of the slaves, including Mary, chose to stay with Elizabeth. It was discovered that Mary Bowser was very intelligent, so she was taught to read and write. Elizabeth Van Loo had formed a circle of spies with the Union Army. Her goal was to pass on as much information as she could about the Confederacy and the Confederate Army. When Mary was about 14, Elizabeth arranged to have her employed at the Confederate White House. She was to act as if she was a dumb, slow slave. Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederacy, was from Mississippi. He was used to dumb, slow slaves, so he hired her. It is said that Mary was a good actress and played the part well. In fact, the president thought he had hired a dumb, slow slave. In fact, he had hired a very intelligent young woman. As she went about her chores in the Confederate White House, she listened. She remembered, and she wrote down everything she heard. When Jefferson Davis met with his cabinet members, she listened. When he was away from the White House, she snooped around, reading dispatches, taking notes, and passing on what she'd heard. Mary passed on highly classified information to Union spies, such as Confederate troop movements, military strategies, and Treasury reports. She even passed on how much money they had. Her intelligence information was passed on to Union officers all the way up to the commander of the Union Army, General Ulysses S. Grant. At the end of the war, Ulysses S. Grant became President of the United States. He said this about Mary Bowser, I quote, "She passed on the most effective and useful of all the information I received from Richmond during the Civil War." End of quote. This is a very high compliment to this young woman. For centuries, her story as the Union's most effective spy was not known. But in 1995, Mary Bowser was inducted into the Military Intelligence Hall of Fame as one of the highest placed and most productive espionage agents of the Civil War. Mary Bowser succeeded in a highly dangerous mission to the benefit of the Union and in her effort to free her people who were still in bondage. I want to emphasize that what she was doing was very dangerous. It's not known what happened to Mary Bowser. Jefferson Davis knew there was a leak in his White House and may have suspected Mary. This is what the resource information said. I seriously doubt that Jefferson Davis thought that a slave could pull that off. Mary is believed to have married and moved abroad, but her whereabouts actually remain unknown. What is known is that Mary Bowser did a great service to the Union Army in helping to win the Civil War and bringing the institution of slavery to an end. Mary Elizabeth Bowser, a phenomenal ex-slave woman who outsmarted the system. My information comes from the New World Encyclopedia and other sources. The next slave diva is Ellen Craft. Now this is one to just stop and take a deep breath. Ellen Craft was born in 1826 on a slave plantation in Jones County, Georgia. She was born to a mulatto slave woman and her slave master, so Ellen looked like a white person, and this figured prominently into their story. She married a slave from a plantation in Macon, Georgia, by the name of William. William was a master carpenter. He was so good that he was rented out by his master to local builders. William was allowed to keep part of his money, which he saved, and this was unusual for a slave. The story takes an almost amusing turn when in the fall of 1848, they decided that they didn't want to spend Christmas in slavery, so they planned a great escape. Ellen dressed up as a white man, and William posed as her personal servant. With the money they'd saved, they bought first-class tickets on a train to New Orleans. There they again bought first-class tickets on a steamboat. Ellen was so convincing as a wealthy white planter that she was invited to dine with the captain. The couple arrived in Philadelphia on Christmas Day of 1848. They eventually traveled to Boston, Massachusetts, where they connected with the free black community and the abolitionist movement. Their daring escape from slavery became the story to talk about, and it was highly publicized. This couple then became celebrated as famous fugitive slaves. In Boston, they were encouraged to go on the speaking circuit and tell about their experience in slavery. This was really how the abolitionists worked: get some former slaves in a big city in a free state before an audience of sympathetic, wealthy supporters and have them tell the stories and talk of the horrors of slavery. So because they were able to really outsmart the system, game the system, you might say, the Crafts became very popular on the abolitionist speaking circuit. This daring couple in 1849 taunted their former slave masters by sending out Christmas cards which read, "Merry Christmas, the great escape from slavery of William and Ellen Craft. They were in a free state, in a free city, and they felt safe." But in 1850, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act. This meant that slave catchers could come into a free state and force escaped slaves back into slavery. So even in free Massachusetts, in the free city of Boston, they were no longer safe. So they had a decision to make. They were at great risk of being caught and brought back into slavery, and you can bet that they would have been caught. So they decided to flee. They left and went to England, and they stayed in England until slavery ended. But they didn't keep silent even in England. They continued to tell of their great escape and to speak out against slavery. In 1860, they even published a book, The Great Escape of William and Ellen Craft from Slavery. William and Ellen Craft chose freedom, possibly death, over slavery. What they did was very dangerous, but the call to freedom was greater than their fear. This was a courageous couple, and it's really a fun story. I really enjoyed reading about them. They really did outsmart the system, and they really are worthy to be remembered and placed in our legendary Hall of Fame. William and Ellen Craft. Our next slave diva is Elizabeth Keckley. This woman's story is so compelling that I'll just have to do a separate video to cover it. In this video, however, I'll give the highlights of her life. Elizabeth Keckley was born in Dinwiddie County, Virginia in February of 1818 in the slave quarters of a Colonel Armistead Burrell. She grew up thinking that a slave on another plantation was her father, but she was to learn as a young woman that her slave master was actually her biological father. This woman had a traumatic childhood. She was both physically and sexually abused. Elizabeth Keckley was a beautiful woman. Because of her exquisite looks, she was forced into a relationship with a white man as a young woman, and this relationship produced a child, a son. She was a gifted seamstress, a designer of beautiful, colorful clothes. Although still a slave, she was able to build a wealthy and loyal clientele, and this is what saved her. In 1855, after many years of hard work, Elizabeth had saved $1,200, in which she bought freedom for herself and her son. In 1860, she moved to Washington, D.C. Through connections with former white clients, she was able to establish a dressmaking business. Word of her talent got around, and after a while, her business was thriving. Soon she was designing clothes for the wives of the prominent men in town. Jefferson Davis's wife, Verena, Robert E. Lee's wife, Mary Custis Lee, and the wife of Stephen Douglas. At last, the wife of Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, came calling. Elizabeth Keckley became the favorite designer of Mary Todd Lincoln. Mrs. Lincoln was a clothes horse, and that is well documented. And Elizabeth created beautiful designs, as you can see in these pictures. These dresses are beautiful even by today's standards. And the dresses that is on the screen now was designed for Mrs. Lincoln to wear to the second inaugural ball of President Lincoln. Once Elizabeth became a successful designer, she did not forget her people. Runaway slaves, who were called contraband, descended upon Washington, D.C. as the promised land. What they found was a situation that was not much better than the one they left on the plantation, except now they were calling themselves free. But Elizabeth saw the need, and she established the Contraband Relief Association to provide food, shelter, and medical care for these runaway slaves. She networked with the independent black churches and the free blacks of the city to help with the necessities for these people. Historians tend to make a lot about Elizabeth Keckley's relationship with Mrs. Lincoln, and it is important and it's understandable. And I'll say that for another video because it's something that I find it also compelling, but I want this one to be about her. Elizabeth Keckley lived to be 89 years old. Her son was killed at the Battle of Wilson's Creek in the Civil War. In spite of poverty, brutality, and misfortune, Elizabeth Keckley kept her dignity and rose above her circumstances. And you can tell in the picture that she carried herself with a particular dignity and with class. The system could not break Elizabeth, and it made a serious effort to do so. And I'll talk about that in another video. But she stood her ground, and she kept her dignity about her. And in that way, if that way alone, she outsmarted the system. Elizabeth Keckley was a phenomenal woman, and I am happy to tell her story. Our next slave diva is Harriet Robinson Scott. Harriet Robinson was born a slave in Virginia in 1820. She was born into the household of a federal agent named Lawrence Tolliver. Lawrence Tolliver moved around a lot, and when Harriet was a teenager, they moved to Minnesota. It was in Minnesota that Harriet met her husband-to-be, Dred Scott, a name we're very familiar with. Harriet and Dred Scott married in 1836. She then became the property of Dr. John Emerson, Dred Scott's slave master. The couple traveled to several states with the doctor and his wife, but they ended up in Missouri, St. Louis to be exact. Harriet and Dred Scott became parents to two daughters, Eliza and Lizzie Scott. In 1843, Dr. John Emerson died, and his widow, Irene, inherited the Scott family. She hired them out to work and took all of their money. In 1846, Harriet petitioned the court for her freedom due to the fact that she lived in the free state of Minnesota. Harriet was aware that she'd have a good chance of being granted her freedom. Dred Scott also petitioned for his freedom in 1846 in a separate case. He petitioned on the same grounds as his wife, that he lived in free states and was therefore entitled to his freedom. Irene Emerson found a way to keep the Scott family in the custody of the St. Louis County Sheriff, and she continued collecting their wages. On January 12th of 1850, Harriet Scott was granted her freedom, but Irene Emerson intervened again and appealed the ruling. This time, the St. Louis District Court combined Harriet and Dred Scott's cases so that the entire Scott family was included in the Dred Scott versus Sanford case. This case dragged on for 11 years, but in 1857, the Supreme Court ruled that the Scotts would remain slaves. Pictured here is Roger B. Taney. He was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at the time of the ruling. The court ruled that Dred Scott was not a citizen but property. Roger Taney further stated that Black people cannot be citizens of the United States and have no rights except the ones that white people give them. Whites are superior to blacks. Slavery is legal. End of quote. This ruling was a serious blow to the Scott family, but 2 months later, a man named Taylor Blow bought the Scotts and immediately set them free. Dred Scott, unfortunately, lived only 18 months as a free man, but Harriet continued working and even bought her own home. She and her daughters lived free for the rest of their lives. In this picture is Charlie Taney. He is a descendant of the Chief Justice who refused to free the Scott family. Charlie is apologizing to the descendants of Dred Scott for his uncle's words. In this picture are descendants of Dred Scott. They are honoring their ancestor at his gravesite. Both men left legacies. One left the legacy of shame, and the other left the legacy of fame. Harriet Robinson Scott indeed outsmarted the system. She petitioned for her right to be free, and though the courts ruled against her, she was nevertheless set free 8 years before slavery ended. She is a beacon of hope and courage. She stood on her right to be a free human being, and in the end, she prevailed. Harriet Robinson Scott, a phenomenal woman who married a phenomenal man. Our last slave diva is Mary Ellen Pleasant. Mary Ellen was born in Augusta, Georgia on August 19, 1814. In her autobiography, she states that her mother was a full-blooded Louisiana black woman. She was of mixed-race heritage. The identity of her father is uncertain. When Mary Ellen was young, she was sold as a bonded servant to a Quaker storekeeper in Nantucket, Massachusetts. As a young adult, Mary became deeply involved in the abolitionist movement. She was an adamant supporter of the Underground Railroad and spent her life working tirelessly to end slavery. She married a wealthy, white-passing floor contractor named James Smith. This man had bought a plantation and freed the slaves that came with it. Mary Ellen and James Smith helped runaway slaves out of the South and into Ohio and other free states, including Canada. James Smith died 4 years after they married, but left money and instructions for her to continue working with the Underground Railroad. In 1848, Mary Ellen began a partnership with John James Pleasant, called J.J. He was also an abolitionist. Apparently, she only dealt with abolitionist men. When attention was brought to their operation in Massachusetts, they moved to New Orleans. While in New Orleans, they heard about the California gold rush. J.J. went ahead and checked out the prospects. He wrote back that the area was promising for the Underground Railroad. When Mary Ellen reached California in 1852, she passed for white. However, she did not hide her identity from her black acquaintances. She had operating capital, and she used it to finance businesses. She invested in laundries, dairies, restaurants, and she opened a boarding house. What's impressive is that she did much of the work in these businesses herself. Mary Ellen was still heavily involved in the Underground Railroad. When ex-slaves arrived in San Francisco, she employed some in her businesses or helped others to find work elsewhere. Mary Ellen became an activist for civil rights, and she was not shy about bringing discrimination lawsuits against offending parties. When she and two other black women were ejected from a trolley, she brought a lawsuit against the company and won. Because of her activism, Mary Ellen was called the mother of civil rights in California, or the Harriet Tubman of California. Her businesses were also thriving. On the advice of a bank clerk named Tom Bell, she invested in Quicksilver. With the success of her other business ventures, she amassed a fortune of $30 million, $800 million by today's estimates. Her investments helped start Wells Fargo Bank, and she is considered one of the first self-made black women millionaires in America. Her resolve to see slavery abolished cannot be overstated. Her most spectacular effort was her decision to fund John Brown, the revolutionary that led the attack on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia in 1859. She sent $30,000 to fund the raid, and the note found in his pocket after he was killed was written by her. It read, "The axe is laid at the root of the tree. When the first blow is struck, there will be more money and more help." The raid was designed to speed up the Civil War, which abolitionists believed would bring an end to slavery. It was believed at the time that wealthy white Northerners had provided the funds for the raid. For certain, nobody would have believed that this young, beautiful, white passing woman would have taken such a risk. But in her later years, Mary Ellen wanted it known that it was she that had funded the raid. After the Civil War, Mary Ellen had her race legally changed from white to black. In 1877, after the death of her husband, Mary Ellen built a 30-room mansion which she shared with her business partner, Tom Bell, and his family. Tom Bell died in 1892. His widow, Teresa, sued Mary Ellen for her fortune, claiming that her husband had created the fortune. Apparently, Tom Bell had registered all of the businesses in his name as sole proprietor and not a partner of Mary Ellen's. Teresa smeared Mary Ellen's name, telling the press that she'd passed for white, that she practiced voodoo, and that she'd opened a brothel. The courts ruled against Mary Ellen, and she lost most of her fortune. She lived destitute in her old age and died on January 4, 1904. She is buried in Tulare Cemetery in Napa, California. In 2015, the San Francisco African American Historical and Cultural Society erected a memorial in honor of Mary Ellen Pleasant. It is located at the intersection of Octavia Street and Bush Street. The association honored her for her work with the Underground Railroad and also for desegregating San Francisco's public transportation system. Mary Ellen Pleasant outsmarted the system. She did what she had to do to help her people. She passed for white when that was beneficial, but she returned to her roots when she carried out her mission. And even though she lost or was cheated out of her wealth, she leaves behind a rich legacy of character, courage, and love. Mary Ellen Pleasant, you are a phenomenal woman. You are an outstanding woman. You are a remarkable woman. I honor you and I take off my hat to you. And these are the Phenomenal 5. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you will leave a comment, subscribe, and share it with your friends.